Steenhuisen. I'm joined by Angelo Fick, eNCA's senior researcher. Angelo, when you look at the question paper, it's basic questions. It's questions that have to do with the economy, the plans for the economy, and then questions about investigations and holding the executive accountable and the security, state security apparatus. How did we move from there to that moment we just saw now? Is the honeymoon well and truly over?
Well, I think everything went according to plan in the first hour to hour and a half, and that's when I think things started falling apart and there were frays at the edges. And I think it begins with the EFF's insistence on getting their way in a particular way, and that gets Cyril Ramaphosa's back up. He then sends somebody from the room. And what we see here, of course, is a kind of response from the president himself, looking as if he's about to lose his temper, then losing his temper, and behaving in a quite unparliamentary manner. After all, the president is there as a member of the executive to account to the people's representatives. And whatever position he may have as head of government and head of state, he's in that chamber to answer people's questions, and he is there, in other words, to respect them. And we've come from a history of that relationship being slightly fraught. And here I think Cyril Ramaphosa could have handled the issue much better than he did.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, the build-up to that, as you say, was characterized by that situation that arose with that EFF Member of Parliament being asked to leave the chamber. In a way, it was almost like Back to the Future in a kind of way, where you had the president sitting there and you had the person who was chairing the session in this exchange with the members of the opposition, particularly the EFF. What was so difficult about that statement that he made? Because the president, at the root of that particular situation was the president suggesting that, you know, the ANC took a resolution on land expropriation without compensation, and then the EFF sought to appropriate that by rushing to parliament and formalizing it. One gets the sense that it's not merely about sequence and order of events, it's about political mileage and how you are perceived, isn't it?
And ownership of the debate and the issue itself. So we know that the ANC has spent, and we can see it, has spent quite a lot of energy taking that back and owning the land debate and land restitution issue as their own, even though they voted on an EFF motion in Parliament earlier this year. And they're now actually suggesting that that comes out of the 2017 conference, and therefore it's an ANC motion. The EFF suggests that it comes from their founding documents in 2014, and therefore it's their motion, it's the ANC following. So this is politicking a year ahead of an election. But I think the issue is whether or not the word deliberate was the big bugbear, the issue that makes it an objectionable point. But if that had been the case, then certainly Cyril Ramaphosa is within his rights to suggest that this must be withdrawn, and in the failure of withdrawal, suggest the punishment, which in this case was asking the MP to leave. But then later to ignore the very, very clearly unparliamentary language of the president, and to suggest, as he did, and we didn't play that bit, where he says the president has withdrawn, when actually that isn't what Cyril Ramaphosa said. He said, I will agree to withdraw, and then wanted to add conditions. And in that exchange, I think the idea of the Speaker protecting the members of Parliament from executive excess is being turned around, and we're back in, as you said, Back to the Future, of Baleka Mbete's role, as it was perceived for so long, protecting the President from being too vociferously interrogated by members of Parliament.
I want us to move into the substance of the issues that the President was answering to in just a moment. But let me ask you, you know, given the separation of powers between, you know, the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature, is there something that President Cyril Ramaphosa could have done to sort of diffuse the situation? It's been going so well for him in Parliament, and previously there was much criticism of former President Jacob Zuma and how he would be sitting there and watching the members of the opposition being removed violently by the Parliamentary Protection Services. Could Cyril Ramaphosa have played a kind of subtle role to diffuse the situation?
He may be very exhausted, which is why he didn't repeat the gesture that he made earlier in the year when it was Baleka Mbete who refused to allow the EFF to address a particular question at the president. And he then said, no, I'll address that question, and then gave them a certainty or a guarantee that he will come back to them in 7 days. He could have done something similar here by suggesting to the parliamentary chair that he will address the issue, withdraw the remark and move on, and possibly issue an apology if he wanted to. But he chose not to. Also, if he was so riled by what members of the DA were saying, as Naledi Pandor indicated, that there were interjections that she said, bordered on the offensive. I don't know what borders of offence look like, but he could have gone to the parliamentary chair and said, I seek your protection, I'd like to answer this question, could you discipline your members? So there are all sorts of ways to deal with it on paper, or ideally, but I think he dealt with it in a moment of great exhaustion and irritation, because he didn't just say it once, he repeated it several times, and he pointed his finger in the direction of the DA, and we've had members of the ANC object to having fingers pointed at people. So there are, I think, moments in which the impartiality of speakers become questionable because they choose party loyalty. And here, I think, is a moment where how this was handled needs to be looked at, because I think Cyril Ramaphosa would not like to go into his term next year being seen to be protected by the parliamentary officers.
It must be said, this was quite revealing, that particular moment, but also in terms of how the president was, sort of playing politics to a certain degree. Let's get into the substance of things. The president was in Parliament, of course, to address issues. Some of the questions had to do with the work of the investment envoys that he has appointed that will go out and sort of try and convince investors that South Africa is open for business. Let's take a listen to what he said about the role of various sectors of society in encouraging investment in the economy.
We expect that all of us as South Africans will play an active role in making sure that our country is attractive to investments. And all of us, one and all, can play that role. It's not only a role that should be played by government. Indeed, the private sector can also play this role, and we have seen how well they've played this role. They don't only play this role when we go on road shows with them, but they also play these roles by actively participating in various initiatives and interventions that are aimed at improving the investment climate in our country. They have been very vocal in terms of raising issues that are of concern to them, which they believe impede investment in our economy, and we've been addressing those. But we've also encouraged them not to keep quiet, but to keep raising matters which they think can be a barrier to investment. And we will work together with them to continue addressing issues that could stop investors from looking at our country with an interesting eye with regards to investment. Labour also has an important role to play in this, and we've been heartened by having Labour accompanying us on a number of road shows, which means that they have really truly realized the importance of all of us speaking with one voice, working together, and moving towards building this social compact.
So in a way, there's not much that's new there in what the president has been saying. This has been his message consistently in the past few months of his term of office. South Africa is on a path to recovery. We are starting to do things differently. We are fixing our state-owned enterprises. But the opposition sought to try and get him to speak directly to how do you juxtapose this message that we are open for investment with your language around expropriation of land without compensation. How well did he do in addressing those issues?
I think it was always going to be a very, very difficult balancing act, because there are so many constituents invested in this new dawn. And the first constituents are, of course, the ANC, because they need to have the party rejigged ahead of an election. It's also that government needs to be seen to clear up its own business around corruption issues and these struggling SOEs. And then there is this issue of the land question and expropriation without compensation and its constitutionality and various, and he spoke about the 140,000 submissions that have been given on how to deal with this. And I think it's a moment in which political parties showed their political interests ahead of an election here. So you have a particular liberal paradigm inside the Democratic Alliance asking questions of how land expropriation is going to affect issues of economic growth, because it has to do with security of tenure and business confidence. But what I found missing, what I didn't hear from any of these MPs, even though they spoke about the minimum wage at one point, was that there is a national bus strike going on that affects millions of people across this country, that we had a national strike by a trade union federation on the 25th of April. It's as if that the disconnect between this idea of regrowing the economy is focused on political parties' own projects. It's not really as connected with the millions of people who are sending a message in various ways across this country, the protests that are going on around service delivery issues, and it's fixated on the 750,000 jobs that will be lost if you implement the minimum wage. It's focused on how the land reform project may or may not influence potential investors. And so I thought of Cyril Ramaphosa's response as being very much his, in terms of those basket of commitments he came back to South Africa with from Davos and the World Economic Forum. It's really inside this business paradigm. And I think what many South Africans are asking is whether or not we don't risk, if we're not too careful, if we're not careful enough, having jobless economic growth. This idea that investors will benefit greatly, but you will not have great amounts of job growth, because we still live in the country with the greatest Gini coefficient, income inequality, and these are issues that will have to be dealt with.
I think you're absolutely right about the issue of the multiple constituencies, because somewhere in there we did see Cyril Ramaphosa, the former trade unionist, coming into play with commitments on this issue of the labor brokers and how he's going to engage the Minister of Labor to try and make sure that that issue is dealt with once and for all. But let's